Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our discussion, History is Not an Accident, the return of molotovs and ribbentrops. This is the second event of our seminar series, and there are at least 3 more to come. Let me already say that our next one will happen exactly 2 weeks from now, 1 hour later, and it's titled Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, Memory, Resistance, and the Future. Our first 2 seminars are organized in collaboration between Tallinn University, Institute of Humanities, Research Grant, Memory and Environment, and the Ruta Association for Central, Southeastern and Eastern European, Baltic, Caucasus, Central and Northern Asian Studies in Global Conversation. I'm Epp Pannus. I have the honor to open today's seminar in my dual role as an associate professor at Tallinn University and a member of Ruta's Board of Representatives and the head of Ruta's Initiatives Committee. Before I give a word to the moderator of this event, a bit of housekeeping. In order to avoid trolling, we have muted all audience members, and please use Q&A function to submit questions to the host of this session, and our moderator will present your questions to our speakers. Our moderator today is Uno Bergmane, a Latvian historian working on the Soviet collapse. She's a researcher at the University of Helsinki. Her first book, Politics of Uncertainty, the United States, the Baltic Question, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. Thank you, Una, so much for putting this seminar together, and please take it over from here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start today by expressing my solidarity once again with Ukrainians who now have to face not only Russian military aggression, but also another type of aggression from the United States. And solidarity to all of the people who have been affected by the events of the recent weeks. We will talk today about what has happened and how can we move forward in these uncertain times. I will first introduce our speakers, and then we will proceed to our conversation. So today we have 3 speakers. Kseniya Oksamytna is a reader in international politics at City University in London. Her research interests focus on international organizations, security, and peace operations. And her book, Advocacy and Change in International Relations, Communication, Protection, and Reconstruction in United Nations Peacekeeping, was the winner of last year's International Studies Association Book Prize. Our next speaker will be Terrell Starr. He is an independent journalist based in Ukraine, whose work helps non-experts understand world politics and to understand why we should care about world politics. And his expertise focuses on Ukraine and Eastern European politics, as well as on communicating foreign policy issues in accessible ways. And finally, Mart Kuldkepp is an Estonian Scandinavist and historian. He completed his PhD in Scandinavian Studies at the University of Tartu in 2014, and then already in 2015, he joined University College London, where he is currently a professor of Estonian and Nordic history. And Mart specializes in Scandinavian and Baltic history and politics. Today, we will not have the traditional presentations. We will have more of a conversation. I will ask each of our speakers specific questions which are targeted towards their specific expertise. So my first question will be to Kseniya. Kseniya, you are an IR scholar. So how does your expertise in the history and in theory of international relations help you to understand the current Russian-American reapproachment or approachment? And how can we situate these events? Are they another episode in this long tradition of Western betrayal of Europe's East? We think about Munich and Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Yalta. Or are we witnessing truly unprecedented events?
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And it's always a pleasure to participate in events which are, organized with Friends of Ukraine and with solidarity to Ukraine. Thank you very much for that. And indeed, it's difficult times, and it's still hard to assess how difficult they're going to become in the coming days. But I think that we indeed witness very significant changes in international diplomacy. And I think that when we think about this notion of the betrayal of the East by the West, and of course, the analogies with the beginning of the Second World War are very prominent here. We also need to recognize that this time the East is really not a homogeneous group of actors. And within Europe's East, we do have some actors that currently block consensus, for example, within the EU and NATO on important initiatives. And I'm thinking primarily of Hungary, but also Slovakia is among those actors. So when we think about the East in this context, we need to remember that there is a lot of heterogeneity within the region in their approaches to supporting Ukraine and resisting Russian narratives and Russian positions. And last week, I had the pleasure of speaking at the University of Helsinki at another event. And it was just before the events at the UN unfolded that were supposed to commemorate the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And many interesting things happened at the UN. And I think that they also speak to the changing roles of Russia and the US in the global security architecture. So I think we all have heard about this competing resolutions at the General Assembly, proposed by the US alone and proposed by the EU and partners, including Ukraine. And both were adopted, and they have slightly different language, and there was a vote on specific amendments. So ultimately, the language of both resolutions was broadly acceptable to Ukraine. Both resolutions stressed the commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, this kind of basic foundations of international law. But at the same time, in the UN Security Council, a resolution was adopted that didn't even mention those principles. The US essentially pushed through this initiative. And unlike the General Assembly, where there is a vote on each amendment, at the Security Council, the procedure is different. And eventually, the resolution was adopted. And it contains very weak language on the commitments to Ukraine territorial integrity. And I think the very process through which the US managed to achieve it was also illustrative of the US's approach to international relations under the new administration. So the president of the Security Council is China, or rather was China in February. And the US put a lot of pressure on China to schedule the vote on the Security Council resolution before the General Assembly resolution. And China resisted, but the US was very undiplomatic in its insistence on doing things its way, including towards other major international powers, including towards its partners on the Security Council, France, and the UK. The US acted fast and alone. There were no consultations with France and the UK before it tabled a particular resolution, which is really unprecedented. You know, in the Security Council, there is this notion of permanent three Western members, the P3, that always act in concert. And they pre-negotiate everything before they open the floor to the discussions with China and Russia, and then the rest of the Security Council membership. This time, it wasn't done this way. The US acted alone, which is very illustrative of the approach they take. So in a very weird way, the US managed to disrespect not only Ukraine in the past few weeks, but also China, France, the UK, so both partners and other stakeholders in international security governance. So in that sense, I think we're seeing something quite unprecedented. And then in terms of the actual US, Ukraine and Russia relations, it's very worrying to see the moves by the US to decrease or cut off some forms of military support. So the news from today's morning is that Maxar Technologies are no longer providing satellite data to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian military, which is one of the forms of support that the US has been providing. Of course, it's a private company, but the US essentially directed the private company not to share the data with Ukraine anymore. And there is a decrease in intelligence sharing. There is a decrease in the types of intelligence that Ukraine needs for strikes inside Russia. And of course, the pause on the general military aid. And I think that the Ukraine's decreased ability to strike inside Russia is very worrying at this particular moment in time, because ultimately Zelensky proposed a truce, a temporary cessation of some forms of military action, and he proposed a truce that would apply exactly to the attacks in the air and in the sea. And Ukraine has conducted a fairly successful campaign of strikes within the Russian territory, as well as within the Black Sea area aimed at the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And by pausing these forms of military engagement, Ukraine could actually offer a significant concession to Russia. And, everybody's talking about how Ukraine needs to show a commitment to peace. Ukraine has to offer some realistic concessions. But at the same time, now with the US's efforts to curtail Ukraine's ability to do it, it essentially takes out a very important card. Zelensky is saying that we're not playing cards, but ultimately it is one of the factors in potential negotiations. So I think that things are really shifting, not in a good way, unfortunately, and it applies not only to the relations between the US and Ukraine and Russia, but also to the US's general role in the international security order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kseniya. My next question will be to Terrell. So Terrell, in the past, you have drawn comparisons between the Ukrainian experience and the Black experience. So how can this perspective about these possible similarities, along with the knowledge about white supremacy, how this perspective and how this knowledge can help us understand Trump's attempts to humiliate and provoke the Ukrainian president during an official meeting?
Thank you very much for the question. And I am the host of Black Diplomats podcast, and that's where I spend my time talking about the intersections of all oppressions. All oppressions are interrelated, and it doesn't matter if you're Black, it doesn't matter if it's colon or white or from Asia or elsewhere, or if you were colonized by the Russian Empire or was subjugated to fascist Jim Crow rule, and before that, slavery. Because at the end of the day, one of the things we need to make clear is that Trump, like Putin, wants to go back. He wants to go back to the day. Putin wants to go back to the days of empire. Trump wants to go back to the days of Jim Crow. And we both know that because both Putin and Trump have always talked about the past, because that is the point of prosperity where their respective peoples were perceived to be thriving, which was at the subjugation of other people, particularly minorities. What makes this comparison so germane to Ukraine is that the way in which Trump and the MAGA contingency has discussed Ukraine has been very similar to the way that he discusses poor people, that Trump describes poor people and people of color who use welfare services. And there is a term that was used for this popularized by Ronald Reagan, and it was called the welfare queen, which was this stereotypical Black woman in the big city who was on food stamps, who wore a fur coat and who wore a fur hat and drove around in a Cadillac all while buying shrimp and caviar on food stamps. And so what Reagan was able to do very effectively was he did not interrogate the systems of redlining, the systems of Jim Crow, the system of political subjugation. He didn't deal with racist urban planning. What he said was that the reason why these people are in the state that they are is because they're lazy and they do not work hard enough. This is the same language and the same attitude that Donald Trump used during his entire campaign to discuss, to talk about Ukrainians to Americans. Because ultimately, what Ronald Reagan wanted to do and what he was effective at communicating was saying to the white American, the reason why you are not able to economically achieve at the rate that you are supposed to, because you are white, is because you have these lazy Black people who are siphoning economically from your progress. That is the same language and the same explanation that Trump uses to describe aid to Ukraine. So as opposed to the Ukrainian wearing the fur coat, they have the audacity to drink lattes at McDonald's because they don't want to be depressed all day. He keeps bloating the number $500 billion that is going to Ukraine, where it should go. It should be going to the border, as Mike Johnson repeatedly said, to keep the border safe. And we all know that Donald Trump, when he describes the border, when he famously came out in his announcement for president in 2016, was that we need to keep the rapists and murderers out. So the money that is going to Ukraine is, the way that he describes it, is making white people less safe, because the rapists, and forgive me, for using the term, the rapists are coming in to assault your daughters, and these are white daughters. It's all racism. It's all xenophobia tied in, and racism tied into one. We need to put more of our money into law enforcement because Haitians are eating dogs and cats. And so when Zelensky entered into the White House, he was not a head of state. He was a freeloader of a nation full of people who did not express their fortitude for the $180 billion in overall aid that they don't even deserve credit for because they never advocated for it. And B, J.D. Vance actually voted against a $60 billion bill while he was a senator to send additional aid to Ukraine. But the reason why this is connected is because my work makes one thing very clear. The racism and the virulent white supremacy that has long been targeted at Black people, at Mexicans, at Asians, the transphobia directed at to transgender people, who make up about 1% of the population in the United States of America, can easily be converted to the type of xenophobia that Trump has used to describe Ukrainians. What is unfortunate in the ways in which we talk about Ukraine as I close is that the contemporary think tank world in the academy has long extrapolated racism from a larger conversation about how racist urban planning ties into overall white supremacy. And so it gives Eastern Europeans this false hope that they have the complexion for the protection. And as we see with 240,000 Ukrainians under the threat of essentially being deported, shows one thing, that the hatred that is directed towards people who look like me can be easily converted to the quote unquote freeloaders that look like them. And so the whole goal is to reunite around one message of unity, because at the end of the day, this racism that Trump has fueled very much is impacting the Ukrainians.
Terrell, thank you so much for this. My next question is to Mart. So Mart, in an essay that you wrote in 2022, you criticized those Western attitudes that frame support for Ukraine as a form of charity. These attitudes that lead to expectation of obedience and gratitude for this so-called charity. And you describe this approach as privilege blind, superficial, and narcissistic. So now it seems that this mindset appears to have become a cornerstone of American foreign policy. So what are the implications for Ukraine and for other countries in our regions from Central Asia to the Baltic states?
Thanks, Una. Thanks for inviting me to speak. And also many thanks to the previous speakers, especially to you, Terrell, for this excellent parallel with the welfare queen discourse, which sort of ties into what I thought I was going to say. The first thing I wanted to say is that this more recent development, as you said, this becoming a cornerstone of sorts of US foreign policy, I would say it's in some ways part of a broader phenomenon, which is the Trump administration's kind of basic and extremely transactionalist worldview. So the underlying idea being that every favor must always be paid for, every so-called deal is only to be understood in a very narrow material sense, every action is a zero-sum game with winners and losers. And there are no win-win solutions. Building trust, building goodwill is not important, and power is the only thing that matters. And in this sense, this very common Western form of disassociation from Russia's war against Ukraine that you described and that I had described in my 2022 essay, it fits really well into this broader Trumpian paradigm. He sees everything that the West does for Ukraine as a kind of sales transaction by default, and the more desperate the consumer appears to be, the more, of course, they should be paying, because this is the logic of the businessman. In a way, this reminds me of this ancient Roman story about Crassus, the fire chief and the richest man in Republican ancient Rome. He was the fire chief, and whenever a house would go mysteriously up in flames, Crassus would appear, stand next to the house with his firefighter slaves who were ready to extinguish the flames, and then Crassus would be negotiating with the owner of the house to buy him out. So I would say Trump is a kind of modern equivalent of Crassus. He sees Ukraine being in massive trouble. He's standing by and negotiates, mineral rights, whatever else he wants to get out of Ukraine. But I also think there is something else that also explains why other people go along with this very transactional worldview. And my theory is, and I've written about this before as well, is that typical Westerners have been socialized essentially into understanding only two different kinds of war. So firstly, there are the wars that take place somewhere far away from us, involving people that have nothing to do with us, and therefore we have the freedom to decide whether to care about these wars or not care about them. And these are the kinds of wars that people habitually hear about in the news and then generally ignore them and go on with their lives. Then the other kind of war that people in the West, or most people in the West can understand, is an all-out nuclear apocalypse. Now, this is familiar from Cold War era scare rhetoric. It's familiar from movies and so on. It's something that has never happened in real life, but it sort of lives vividly in people's imagination. And when it's evoked, it tends to have a kind of paralyzing effect on people's ability to think. And this is why Russia's nuclear blackmail has been so effective. And what I've been trying to do, or maybe what we have been trying to do as well, is to explain to people in the West that Russia's war against Ukraine is in fact a third type of war, which is a type we actually know very well from European history, but then have somehow forgotten about, or most people have forgotten about it. And by this, I mean a war that takes place close to us, involving people that have a lot to do with us, and the outcome of which will have a major impact on us, on our security, on European, transatlantic, and global security. And it's therefore in our common interests to make sure that the aggressor, Russia, is not rewarded and is indeed punished in order to deter further aggression. But this very transactionalist paradigm that Trump and his supporters operate in is completely inadequate for understanding this type of war, one that presumes that some kind of understanding of community interest and a basic familiarity with, let's say, history and geopolitics in general. And instead, they interpret Russia's war against Ukraine as the first type of war. One doesn't really concern us. So we have, therefore, the choice how much we should be caring. And whether it's sort of willful refusal to understand, whether it's lack of education or lack of imagination, doesn't really matter in the end, because the outcome ends up being the same, namely that the security situation for Ukraine, for Russia's neighboring countries, and for the whole world is rapidly deteriorating as we speak.
Thank you very much, Mart. So the second round of questions, I will start again with Kseniya. So you have written extensively on peacekeeping. So how does your expertise help us to understand the current American, Russian, and European discourses on peacekeeping, or maybe we should call them deterrence missions, possible peacekeeping, possible deterrence missions in Ukraine? And a more specific question, do you believe that European forces could have the capacity to deter Russian aggression if we actually come to that point?
Yes, of course. It's an excellent question. And I think that when we start these discussions about potential for peacekeeping in the current phase of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, we also need to remember that during the previous phase of Russian military aggression, we already had a peacekeeping operation by the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that peacekeeping mission didn't do very well due to the situation in which it found itself. So ultimately, Russia denied its involvement in the first phase of the conflict. It maintained that it was the so-called rebels from the Donetsk and Luhansk so-called republics. So it was very difficult to deal with Russia in that format. And actually, the monitoring mission faced difficulties in its everyday work. So it was denied access to most of territory controlled by the so-called republics. So it could only report on things taking place on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian government controlled side. So of course it was biased in its reporting. And Russia used its report for propaganda, twisting the content of those reports. It was saying that it's Ukraine that violates the ceasefire, although the mission itself documented that at least 85% of the ceasefire violations were actually by the forces on non-government controlled territory. So it played a controversial role, and also the way it came to an end is in some way, in many ways tragic, because 3 civilian employees, Ukrainian employees of that mission, are still held in Russian captivity as political prisoners, as hostages, because all the international employees left when things got bad, and Ukrainian employees were left to take administration of the premises and assets of the mission, the official language from their website, and some of them are now held in captivity. Which, of course, also invites parallels to some other international peacekeeping missions, like in Rwanda, where national staff also wasn't evacuated and was killed. And I think this, speaks to the theme of our today's panel, which concerns Russia and Ukraine, but also the questions of global justice, including racial justice. And I think that the hierarchies that apply to non-white populations sometimes also apply to civilian population when they work for international organizations in places which are not considered very important. So I think when we try to imagine a future peacekeeping operation, we need to remember that when things get bad, peacekeeping operations cannot do very much. And when we look at the history of peacekeeping, we know that European peacekeepers have been deployed in various theaters and very often with disastrous effects. We remember the genocide in Bosnia, the Srebrenica genocide, when peacekeepers withdrew because they were duped by a promise given by the aggressors that they would take care of the population. So in general, with peacekeeping, it's difficult to work with that model in case one of the parties doesn't want to cooperate. And I think that right now we're facing the situation where Russia is unlikely to cooperate in good faith with the potential peacekeeping mission, which then leaves the question of what to do in case Russia violates its commitments. Will a potential peacekeeping mission respond by force? Will they, just report, monitor, and withdraw? And in both of those cases, it's difficult to see the utility of a potential peacekeeping mission. Of course, this notion of deterrence is, it does a lot of work in those discussions. So the assumption is this kind of best case planning scenario that will put European troops, Western European troops on the ground. And because of that, Russia is not going to violate its commitments. But most likely it will, judging by their previous behavior, which then puts peacekeepers in a very, very difficult situation. And I think when we talk about peacekeeping, we talk about two different kinds. And one is peacekeeping in so-called permissive environments, where we have a stable ceasefire and peacekeepers just monitor the separation line, kind of the Cyprus example. But I don't think this is what we're going to see in the current phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And then there are also peacekeeping in so-called non-permissive environments, where peacekeepers essentially do the extension of state authority. So peacekeepers help the government take territory, which is not held by the government. Usually it's by rebels in civil war situations. And, in that case, potentially, those peacekeepers, so-called peacekeepers, could make a contribution to Ukraine's effort to reestablish its territorial integrity and control over its entire territory. But that requires a very significant military commitment, and ultimately it does entail entering the war on Ukraine's side. And this is not something that Western European leaders are ready to consider at this point. So I think that the potential model of peacekeeping that could apply in this context is not clear at the moment. And it's difficult to imagine how it might succeed. Of course, the proposal for the so-called Sky Shield is interesting. And this is what Ukrainians have campaigned for since the beginning of this stage of the war. Ukrainians have, at every protest, asked Europe to close the skies for hostile Russian military aircraft. And now this idea is being discussed in Western European capitals. But again, what happens in case Russia doesn't respect its commitments, in case Russia actually tries to shut down one of the planes that monitor the Ukrainian airspace in case of a potential air-based peacekeeping mission? Then again, the question of whether the Western troops, the Western air forces, are going to enter the war on the side of Ukraine becomes very acute. So I think that when we speak about peacekeeping in this context, we need to really imagine how it's going to work and what the potential challenges are.
Thank you, Kseniya. My next question to Terrell. So you have this long expertise in the domestic political dynamics, not only of Ukraine, but also Georgia. And you have followed their efforts, Ukrainian and Georgian efforts, to resist local oligarchy and also Russian interference. So what would you think would be the lessons that progressive forces in the United States could take from the experience of these societies to better prepare for the defense of American democracy? You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So what can progressive forces in the United States learn from the pro-democracy forces of Georgia and Ukraine, for example? I think that it's important for us to establish a larger conversation about democracy in America as a whole before I get to the idea of what we can learn from these democracies in Georgia and Ukraine, starting with the fact that in America, which if you look back to 1619 as the founder of our country, as Nicole Hannah Jones, a journalist at the New York Times, starts it, or to 1776, which is the more recognized genesis of our country, which if we were to start there is 250 years old. For the vast majority of that time, we were never a democracy. Let's just start there. Until the Voter Rights Acts, the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Acts of the late 1960s, that ended in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, and then going into the implementation of those acts into 1970, America itself did not become a liberal democracy, has only been a liberal democracy for a little more than 50 years. So let's just start there. And that goes directly into your question. Because in one respect, I don't have to look to Georgia. I don't think that progressive forces have to look to Georgia or Ukraine for the very simple reason that the people in the American society who advocated for democracy are the people who I think can relate to Ukrainians and Georgians the most, who are Black people. And it's important to keep in mind one key thing. During the 60s, during this fight for justice in the United States of America, we have to realize that that there are large sections of white people who never wanted democracy. And so you're dealing with these people of color forces who were pursuing democracy. And it's so important to bring this up because the pedagogy and the way that we talk about democracy versus communism, for example, we think about these famous points in history where Ronald Reagan said, "Tear down this wall." All the while, this man's policies were doing nothing. Were helping to perpetrate redlining and creating racial walls of his own that he was helping to build up. And so, if we continue to extrapolate Black experience from the American experience, then it's just going to completely misinform us about this very question that you're asking. And so when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and we speed up to now, Ukraine, the rest of the countries that were formerly colonized by Russia have been democracies for 30 years. In reality, if we're looking at the end of Jim Crow in 1968, America has only been a full democracy for roughly 50 plus years. So we are not that much better off from a democratic standpoint than Russia, than Georgia and Ukraine. And so when you ask me if these, what can we learn? I think that Black people in themselves, we have plenty of examples of how, one, the society can learn from us, but then two, I think it's very clear that the vast majority of Ukrainians and Georgians overall, as a country, care far more about democracy overall than many Americans do, because with the majority of the people supporting voters, not necessarily population, but voters voting for Donald Trump, it's very clear that they invested in a man who believes in authoritarianism and a particular type of illiberal democracy that is for the select few, which is nothing more than a kleptocratic version, white version of American society. And so what the vast majority of Americans as a whole can learn from Georgian and Ukrainian pro-democracy groups is to really value what that means once it's taken away from us. But I think that's really challenging for the very simple reason that we have spent so much of, Americans have spent so much of their time fighting democracy. Even to this day, as a journalist, I have personally reported on voting irregularities and voter suppression in my own country. And so it's really challenging to respond to that question because you have a small group of minorities in America that had to fight against a larger white majority for democracy, because within our context, democracy only was designed to benefit white people. And so with that in mind, I think that it would be ideal for all of us. In my work, I draw these links between Black people and Georgians and Ukrainians, because we are the ones that are fighting oppression. We are the ones that are fighting white supremacy and Russian supremacy. Minorities and people of color, in that regard, have far more in common with Georgians and Ukrainians, because the rest of our population does not want what pro-democracy Georgians and pro-democracy Ukrainians want. And I think that before we have any further conversation, we need to establish that one basic fact.
Thank you very much for this excellent insight. So my next question will be to Mart again. So you are a specialist of the Nordic and Baltic regions. So how do you see the role of these countries, Nordic countries, Baltic countries, in the future coalition of the willing for Ukraine's support? Nordic countries, Baltic countries have been among Ukraine's strongest supporters, but how much influence will they have in the emerging Franco-British leadership in Europe? And additionally, the question that has been discussed a lot in the Baltic countries over the last week is, how should we interpret Britain's failure to invite Baltic states to the London summit?
Thank you. I would, of course, want them to be very important in this emerging coalition, maybe even have a central role of sorts, with some caveats, of course, which I'm going to come back to. And the other part of the question, how much influence will we have, is maybe not the most important thing to ask. Maybe it's more important to ask, how can we have more influence? Because obviously we would like to have more. I suppose my attitude towards international politics is fairly pragmatic. So we have seen that global solutions have failed. The UN has not been able to do anything about Russian aggression, except for holding these, kind of useful votes in terms of at least signifying who is on which side, but not anything really beyond that. Then when global solutions fail, of course, as they have, we can try transatlantic solutions, and we have been doing that as well. But now, of course, as we've all been saying, it looks like under the new Trump administration, this avenue is not working particularly well anymore. And the next idea then, of course, is to go for a European solution in lieu of the transatlantic one. And currently we are seeing some important progress on this level. This is maybe one of the main sources of hope on this moment. How well this will work out remains to be seen, because this is all in early stages. But I'm convinced that even, if things do go well on the European level, and I hope they do, there is also a place for sub-regional solutions as well. And the last 3 years, in my opinion, have sufficiently demonstrated that no matter how many times we have said, or no matter how many times we have politely implied that Russia is a serious threat, that it's not just Ukraine's war, that it's Ukraine who is defending us rather than us doing favors to Ukraine, our partners really don't have the ability to understand us. They don't really understand us on a deep enough, serious enough level, because the experience that we have is just not there. And they, because of that, also don't have the imagination of even being able to kind of think of this the same way we do. So in addition to resources, what Europe needs today, in my opinion, is strong moral leadership. And the way to achieve it, and probably the only way, is to bring together the states facing Russia, the states in Russia's immediate neighborhood. And in addition to Ukraine, they include the Baltics, the Nordics. Importantly, they include Poland, which is quickly becoming the militarily strongest European state outside of Ukraine. And the closer we cooperate amongst ourselves, the more influence we can have on the Franco-British axis that might now be re-emerging on the European level. And the more we can do to defend ourselves. And in this connection, of course, I would say the UK's failure to invite the Baltics to the recent London summit is a good example of the work that remains to be done in this area. When this happens, when something like this happens again, the Baltics shouldn't be the only ones protesting. The Nordics should also be protesting, and Poland should be protesting too. We need to make our voices heard in order to amplify the Ukrainian voices, because this is the only channel that exists, the only good enough channel for it, I think, because going back to my previous answer to a previous question, there are certain sort of the deficiencies in Western imagination that are otherwise difficult to deal with. So, like this well-known dictum goes, you should think global but act local, but I would also say you need to act regional. And I don't really like this narrative that sometimes crops up, has done many times over the previous years, that the interests of the frontline states are supposedly different from the interests of the other European states. That somehow we are, because of our sort of geopolitics, more hawkish, and this is just how it is. This is our nature. I think we actually have the same interests. The only difference is the urgency. France and Germany can afford to wait until we have been overrun. We can't afford to wait until then. So we must work together now and early and explain our point of view together to our Western partners as well as we can. And I think the potential is there. You can look at what the Baltic politicians, for example, have been able to or were able to achieve over the first couple of years of war, maybe a bit less after that, but I think we need to go back to the times of 2022 and 23 in that sense of in the sense of being listened to.
Thank you very much, Mart, for your answer. I have the third and final round of questions, and actually it's just one question to the three of you. And it's a question about the past and also the future. So each of you has spent considerable time over the past years supporting Ukraine through your work and through public engagement. Would you like to share a few words about these experiences? And then thinking about the future, how can we think together as academics, journalists, citizens supporting Ukraine? What should we do now when things for Ukraine and also many others of us have become even more complicated? Maybe we can start again in the same way, Kseniya first, and then Terrell, and then Mart.
Sure, it's an important question. And it's a difficult question because I think that we have all had negative experiences with, colleagues. Some of the colleagues we cooperated well in the past, but when it comes to Ukraine, the differences of opinion can be expressed in ways that do not feel collegial. So I think that it's difficult to research Ukraine. And I think that before, Ukraine suffered from a form of neglect in the international relations discipline, at least in the discipline of international security. There were very few people working on Ukraine. And now there is this, new gold rush because Ukraine seems to be the new hot topic. And many people want to write about it without knowing really anything about Ukraine. So it's a very difficult situation again when there is too much attention by people who are not qualified to write about this topic. I don't really have any solutions. I think the Ruta initiative is amazing, and I do really look forward to get involved in some of the in-person events. And I think this efforts to build networks where people who work on the region do it from a perspective that is so different from the traditional Russo-centric perspective that dominates our field. I think all those efforts are really, really valuable. Thank you.
Before I give the floor to Mart, I wanted to remind the audience that you can ask your questions in using the question and answer tool that you see on the toolbar. And so then I will ask your questions to the panelists, but now Terrell.
Sure. So, Kseniya, I definitely relate to what you're saying. Prior to 2022, Ukraine was not in vogue. I like to refer to these quote unquote experts as people who are Russianists who moonlight as Ukraine scholars and Ukraine experts. And going to your question, the way that I do public engagement is I devote a lot of time framing Black experiences and Ukrainian experiences because I have to speak to people in a way that's different from this audience. I have to speak to people in a way that doesn't sound like the traditional think tank, that does not sound like the traditional academy talk. One of my best, of all the talks I've done at universities and whatever venues they were, my best conversation about Ukraine was with my neighbor in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, in New York. A Black man who's been in that neighborhood for all of his life and will never leave that neighborhood. And he saw me and said, "Hey, bro, like, tell me what's going on in Ukraine, bro." And he was like, "Man, you know the reason why I'm happy I saw you? I told my boys at the pool hall that y'all can go anywhere, y'all can go on TV. I know a brother that's right next door to me, and I can get the real scoop of what's going on." That familiarity means everything. That man will listen to everything that I have to say because I have credibility in his eyes. That is the number one thing, credibility. And my work, I frame it as so many people are, while many of us are speaking to the traditional circles, which is important, I devote my time talking to everybody else. And it's everybody else that needs to be on board. Why I go on Instagram and why I share my stories and why I mix these two people together, because more Black audiences feel safe and being a part of the discourse. One of the things that his neighbor said to me in our hour-long conversation, he said, "Terrell, you know, you're a Black man over there. Have you run into those Nazis in Ukraine?" And I had to tell the brother that I would not take my Black self to Ukraine if I had the fear of being attacked by Nazis on the street. It's not this heavy, like academic, heavy, you know, the just highbrow stuff that people want to deal with. They need to know, they need to be spoken to in ways where they don't feel stupid or people feel like they're not qualified to have an opinion. Because at the end of and I'll end this way, I was at a conference, I was invited to lead a discussion about German-US relations as it pertains to Ukraine. And one of the speakers, the CEO of a German organization, was talking about the browning of America. And I don't think he wanted to sound racist, but he ended up being racist. He was saying that essentially our European identity is slowly being erased as America becomes more diverse. And what I reminded him and everyone else of at that conference when it was my time to speak was that the vast majority of people, percentage-wise, that voted for the candidate, i.e. Kamala Harris, and before that, Joe Biden, were Black people who support candidates that care about the transatlantic relationship. The people who supported Trump, those quote-unquote Europeans with their European values and the European ancestry, don't care about it. So we have to, I go to HBCUs, I'm going to be speaking at Morgan State University, one of the bigger historically Black colleges in the United States. That's where the work is. That's where people need to hear about Ukraine. And that's where I go. And so if I can encourage any of you all about how we can come together and help, let's think about going to communities that don't see us and building credibility there. And that's where I think the work begins. And that's how Ukraine will benefit, how Georgians will benefit, and how our community as a whole will benefit.
Thank you very
And
much.
by the way, I don't know if you can see, but I wore my suit. This is my military style Vishivanka, so this is my suit.
Thank you, Terrell. So,
Yeah.
Mart?
Yeah, thanks to both of the previous speakers. Again, I can only agree with a lot of what you have already been saying. I maybe need to be a bit humble here because I think what I have personally done for Ukraine is very little compared to what many other people have done, some of whom have put their lives in danger and so on. What I have tried to do is at least to meet the baseline of not being silent about what I'm seeing and to talk through social media, through opinion pieces, sometimes interviews, podcasts, and so on. And this is not really what I do in my professional life. As you know, I'm a historian of the early 20th century Baltic Sea region. So I wouldn't really say that my understanding of contemporary politics is particularly profound or anything. And my opinions definitely are not those of an expert. They are just those of a kind of random educated person from the Baltics. So if anyone happens to think that my views are very radical, they should, ask my sister who has told me that why I'm writing this, because everybody knows it anyway. But I think it's very important what Terrell said about credibility. Because we all can do something if we think about where our credibility lies. I have personally been able to leverage my ability to write somewhat well in English and my affiliation with a major Western university, which is a very privileged position that I can use for the good to talk about the things that need to be talked about. And other people have something else that they can do instead. So all help is needed, and I would encourage everybody to think about which communities can you address. Where is your leverage that you can use? What is the strength that you can bring on the table? And it is, of course, very true what Kseniya said about the new gold rush. We have people sort of dabbling in this who haven't really been Ukraine experts any time before 2022. And actually, I'm one of those people as well. But I think what's actually most important in the end is that the conversation is ongoing, because there is nothing worse than silence. There is nothing worse than being ignored. And it doesn't almost matter what we say about Ukraine in a kind of very sort of the least common denominator way. It is important that people know that Ukraine exists. It is important that people understand that Ukrainian security matters. It is important that people understand that Ukrainians are real people. They are not some kind of abstract figure of mind that's only mentioned in news and newspapers. So at least this we have been able to achieve, I think, collectively. Ukraine is in the picture, and it is going to remain there as long as we can help it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have one question from the audience, and I will read it. So, and I guess it's to all three panelists. The United States is in a great turmoil internally, and for local people, these local crises can easily overshadow Russia's war against Ukraine. Can you come up with a good and clear argument? How does this war matter to the United States people or other nations who do not have a border with Russia? Maybe, Terrell, we can start with you with this question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So how do I convince Americans who have never been to Ukraine, will never go to Ukraine, be invested in this war? Ultimately, I think it's important to note that American politics describe things as in issues as in a sense that they want to it impacts us, right? And it's about us. Sometimes we have to have a conversation about what it mean, like what our citizenship means beyond our borders, right? And that is a nuanced conversation. I think about Malcolm X, who before his death, he thought about the world. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A lot of his teachings came from Mahatma Gandhi. The Black Lives Matter movement leaned very deeply into liberation for Palestinians. And so we have as Black people, we have a tradition of global solidarity. It's really, well, at least with Black people, it's so with me, and when I talk to my community, I have to let Black people know one basic thing. Our basic definition of whiteness, as we look at it in America, does not fit the rest of the world. For example, when I went to the country of Georgia, Sarkark-Bello, for those who understand Georgian, one of the things that blew my mind in this conversation that I shared to help build this commonality is that after Russia invaded in 2008, because I was there, I was in Georgia when the Russians invaded. I have a penchant of being in places that Russia not only colonizes, but subsequently invades. But walking on a boardwalk in Batumi, and these guys, I was walking with these guys, and they were saying, Terrell, you know, we were in Moscow, but unfortunately we had to flee because we were constantly getting in a fight with skinheads. And he said, we're constantly dealing with racism and discrimination. And so he said, you know, man, we were essentially called the equivalent of the N-word. He's like, then he ended it by saying, bro, in one sense, we're Black just like you. And so what I learned, a lesson from that, was that contrary to what I believe, the white people that I grew up with were not, in fact, the real Caucasians. So I speak to Ukrainians, an old man, and as I'll end, there's an old Ukrainian man in the middle, in downtown Lviv. I was with about 30 different people during our Fulbright program, because I was a Fulbright in 2010, and he approached me. He went through all these people and came to me. What is your name? Do you want to know the history of our country? And then he explained. We are Moscow or Russia wants us to be a colony of Russia. They want to colonize us. They want to enslave us. To many Americans, that is a white man. To Russians, and under the Russian supremacist framework, the Ukrainian is not equal to that of the Russian. And so everything that we know about ourselves, the way in which the stupid, irrational, non-applicable term of white versus Black is wrong. And it took my experience of being in these places and having that man who, quite frankly, only came to me because I think I'm Black and he thought that I would understand. I've had similar other conversations like this in Central Asia, is that so much of what we've learned about each other is wrong. And I think that it's my job and my mission to help course correct. And I'm just so fortunate that I could stand in and be an ambassador for Ukraine to do some of that very work.
Thank you very much. Kseniya, Mart, do you want to add something?
I would maybe add that explaining how this war matters is not that different from explaining why anything else matters. So the only tools that we have are basically narratives, sort of comparisons. So what Terrell was just saying, that's the kind of technique that these are the kind of techniques that we can use, but also it really depends on the target audience. Who are we talking to? And we need to find the means of reaching different people. And as I was saying earlier, I think different people amongst us have different resources to achieve that. So there needs to be a kind of division of labor. I think this is effective. And we need to, as I was also saying before, sorry, I was repeating myself, we need to figure out what our strengths are and then use them, because in the end, some sort of points we want to make are very, very universal. If the rule of law is undermined in one place, it is going to be undermined in a different place as well. Basic moral values matter. Justice and fairness matters. But getting these points across in a way that speaks to people is the challenge, obviously. And this is work that is never going to end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly this is important, to know one's audience and to tailor the messages. and to speak to our friends, our acquaintances, our academic communities, non-academic communities. And I think with the US, perhaps the approach taken by Zelensky right now, how he has shifted from his previous rhetoric of Ukrainian victory to this notion of peace through strength. And I think this notion of strength appeals to many Americans. Of course, the US is the leading country in the world, and they would like to remain the leading country, which makes a lot of sense. But I think when we speak to different people, we need to tailor our messages. So for those who are sort of more liberal, we might try to emphasize the importance of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture and how it has kept the US safe, and how this risk of alienating European allies is a big threat to the US security. On the other hand, people who are more, perhaps let's call them isolationist, who tend to find some of those America First messages persuasive, they also come from the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has also been very, very big on strong United States. And when we actually think about the three countries that are fighting on the Russian side as an alliance, which is Russia, North Korea, and Iran, those are the three countries from the axis of evil from the previous Republican administration. And at the same time, the US is now not very interested in countering that threat. So I think that this appeals to security from different standpoints could be persuasive for Americans on different sides of the political spectrum.
Do you mind if I add something up briefly? I know there are other questions. I just want to add something briefly to the host, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so here's the main thing. A big problem with this is Europe. And here's one basic question. Has Europe decided how far their borders stretch? When I'm here in Ukraine, and you don't have to be here, if you listen to the way that Ukrainians talk, even about the NATO and European Union relationship, I hear Ukrainians say the Europeans. And that sticks out to me because, of course, Ukrainians say, well, yes, we're Europeans, but politically, a lot of the local officials here refer to their colleagues in the West as the Europeans, which denotes to me that at least within a particular context, the Ukrainians don't see themselves a part of that conversation. And I would love to be corrected if I'm wrong, if I'm in my thinking here. And so contemporarily, people, unless you're west of the Berlin Wall, you're really not considered European, at least contemporarily, until you join one of these alliances, NATO or European Union. The same conversation about Poland, the Baltic states, etc. And so I think what the biggest disappointment that I've seen in messaging from Europe is they are not truly devoted to drawing a hard line of how of including Ukraine into that larger European continent. I think that is the fundamental problem. And so when Biden says we will do it for as long as it takes, he himself did not do a really good job of articulating to the American public why we should care about this. It's a standard Democratic talking point that unless you're a member of the party, you don't know what in the world that he's talking about. Because what Donald Trump does very effectively in all of his racism and sexism and transphobia is messaging. One of his most effective talking points in an ad was referring to transgender people. In addition to Ukraine and saying we shouldn't send that money there, Kamala cares about they and them. Donald Trump cares about you. We do not agree with that type of rhetoric, but it's effective as racist as it is. And as it pertains to Ukraine, similar language by MAGA has been used, and the Biden administration never had a counterpoint, and it doesn't appear that the Europeans do either.
Thank you very much. We have in the question answer section 2 questions, and I will read those 2 questions one after another, and then the panelists, you can choose if you want to answer both of them or just one of them. So the first one is, we see plenty of historical comparisons in public discussions of our war, 1938, other imperial wars. Which is such comparison you think are productive to explain Ukrainian positions? Or are there any historical comparisons that can help us understand the Ukrainian position today? And the other question is, thank you all, Germany is an instrumental player. How would you describe their support for Ukraine at this stage? The government, parties, population. And bonus question, is Le Pen in France having second thoughts, I guess, on her position vis-a-vis her relations with Donald Trump?
Maybe on the point of Germany's support, I think we are now seeing maybe the Zeitenwende we should have been seeing in 2022. So I am fairly confident that things are shifting in a more fundamental way, because what you saw over the first years of the war, I mean the full-scale war with Scholz, was that he was completely unwilling to do anything without having the okay from the US administration at the time. So now when this, whether you consider it a constraint or just like a habit of the German leadership is gone, then things will have to be different, whether Germany likes it or not. And Merz's rhetoric has certainly been very, very different compared to Scholz's. And another thing people say about Germany, and I think it's probably true, is that if they do make a decision, then they stick to it. So this maybe compares them favorably to some other countries who say a lot of things but never actually carry through. With Germany, I think if they do make the decisions, then we are likely to see the results. So I think German policies have actually been the first ones to change substantially after what has recently been happening with the Trump administration in the US. And this is really crucial. This is what gives us optimism about the developments on the European level, because if one of the largest and economically most important states of Europe wasn't doing this right now, it would be very difficult to imagine who else would step in. As I was saying about regionalism earlier, small states need to stick together as well. And we are all relatively small, the frontline states facing Russia, with the exception of Ukraine, the largest state in Europe. But this kind of regionalism only really works well if you have a kind of stopgap behind it, some kind of a regional hegemon who is the ultimate arbiter between the smaller states, helps them to overcome their disagreements and so on. So, as I was saying, the Baltics can maybe exercise moral leadership, but they also need the muscle in old Europe, so to say, to make it all happen. So I'm very happy about Germany, to be honest. Yeah, sorry, went on for too long.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go next. So I guess in terms of European politics, we do see some interesting developments, and I'm also perhaps more optimistic about Germany now with the current elections. Indeed, Olaf Scholz has had quite a notorious reputation in Ukraine. As we know, the very verb Scholzin meant to promise something and then underdeliver. We saw some of the negative reactions in Ukraine to how slow Germany was to ultimately do the right thing. They eventually did the right thing on most of the portfolios, but it took so much public pressure and so much public outrage to actually convince them that they need to do it a bit faster. Now we do see the election of a pro-US and pro-transatlantic chancellor. At the same time, in the recent German elections, we could see the rise of far left and far right parties. And, we're, of course, very concerned about the rise of the far right. But in terms of foreign policy, the far left positions are also not very favorable to the current security architecture. There are perhaps all these good calls for Russia to withdraw, but also there are calls to withdraw from NATO. on both fringes of the political spectrum in Germany, we see opinions that are a bit worrying in terms of transatlantic security. And in terms of France, I think we're also seeing interest in developments in the sense that even some of the far-right leaders try to distance themselves from the current US policy. So some of the pronouncements by J.D. Vance or by Donald Trump have been criticized by Marine Le Pen, also by Nigel Farage in the UK. You know, one could not imagine that they would say that J.D. Vance was wrong, but he did. So some positions of the current administration go too far to the right, to, you know, for even the most far-right European leaders. And then, of course, on the question of analogies, no analogy is perfect, but I think what we need to consider is the history of previous mass atrocity campaigns. Not so much wars, but really kind of eliminationist campaigns where one actor wanted to eliminate another actor's, you know, identity or their entire group as a whole. And usually mass atrocity campaigns end with a complete victory by one side. That's why I think the vast majority of Ukrainian supporters and Ukraine itself have emphasized the question of territorial integrity as a precondition for lasting security, because only when the aggressor is pushed out of the territory where they commit mass atrocities, then we can speak about potential peace and security.
Yeah, Terrell, do you want to add something? No.
Can I say one thing? I just came to think of it as Kseniya was speaking. I really don't like drawing parallels with the Second World War because this is the one historical event that people genuinely do know about if they're not historians. But at the same time, people are emotionally very invested in everything to do with the Second World War. So it is a minefield to navigate. But yet it is a minefield we will need to navigate when drawing these comparisons and bringing historical examples, because this is something that people genuinely can relate to. And it is a big challenge for us to do it in a way that actually works.
Yeah. So I think I have time for one more question. So it's incredible conversation. Thank you. Are you concerned with Ukraine fatigue in Europe, like we unfortunately see it in the United States, especially if the conflict continues to shimmer beyond immediately expanding to other parts of Europe? So are you concerned about Ukraine fatigue in Europe?
Well, I guess we have to be concerned. Ukraine fatigue is dangerous because it leads to less support, military, diplomatic, and economic. And there is a huge gap to be filled in those types of support as the US withdrew or paused some forms of its support. So I think with economic support, we can already see that it's going to be a significant reduction. In terms of military support, maybe it's going to be a pause, we don't know. But Europe will have to step up. That's why it's important to continue talking about Ukraine. And I think the sense of panic that Europe experiences now with the unraveling of the transatlantic alliance can help us to maintain the focus on Ukraine. Because now Europe really feels like it's alone. And, you know, all my friends from, you know, Brussels are texting me saying like, oh my God, we don't want to admit it because France has been so smug about it all the time about security independence. But ultimately France was right. And now there is this momentum towards discussions on how Europe can keep itself secure. And luckily, those discussions do include Ukraine. I mean, of course, you know, as Terrell was saying, there is this ambiguous relationship between, you know, Ukraine and sort of core Europe. But this ambiguous relationship, I think, exists for all Eastern European and Baltic countries. Their inclusion is there, but it's sometimes contested or tenuous. And I think Ukraine is currently trying to negotiate, inclusion on similar conditions. So I think that Ukraine fatigue is something we need to campaign against. We need to always remind, people that what's going on right now is the war between two largest armies on the European continent, two largest states. My students sometimes in class say like, "Oh my God, did you know that Ukraine was the second largest European country?" I was like, "Yes, and by some assessments, the 20th most powerful military in the world. It's not insignificant. It's actually a major power conflict." And I think this framing can also help highlight the security costs of it.
Thank you. Mart, Terrell, do you want to add something?
I can add something. Like Kseniya was saying, I think the current situation maybe has changed things in terms of fatigue. I'm less concerned about Ukraine fatigue than I was last year, for example. What I'm more concerned about now is deprioritization, as the US is stopping all aid, has stopped all aid, probably won't be restoring it, and the Europeans as well are turning more inwards and starting to worry about their own security. So whether we can effectively explain that Ukraine's security is European security is the question, and it is again a big task for us, because most electorates in European countries probably don't necessarily see it this way, at least by default. So they would be, happy to invest in the defense of their own country, building up whatever defensive capabilities they need, but they don't really see the reasoning behind the idea of sending, I don't know, peacekeeping troops, or even sending equipment or whatever somewhere else as the security situation is deteriorating. So this needs to be explained. Again, the connections between defense policy and foreign policy, and what it means for European security that somebody else is doing the fighting for them at the moment. This is very immoral, but this is the situation we're in now, and this can't be taken for granted forever. This, I think, is a very important thing to emphasize.
Thank you very much. I think we have I'm just reading the Terrell. You have to leave. Okay, yeah. I think Terrell has to join another panel, and I think we will not have time to continue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much for coming and joining us today. So there is just a comment saying that in the American context, the fact that Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, or in some context first, that not that well known among regular Americans, and that should be kind of emphasized more, and I completely agree with that. I think we will end here. Just before we finish, I wanted to mention two things. One is that obviously today we focused on Ukraine, on the United States. I just wanted to remind everybody that for 130 days, people have been protesting in Georgia against their own oligarchic authoritarian government. And so we should also pay attention to them and what's happening in Georgia. And then what Ed mentioned at the beginning, that in 2 weeks, on March 21st, we will have our next event, which will be devoted to Crimea and Crimean Tatars resistance and the future. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our wonderful panelists. Thanks to audience, and thanks to Ruta Association and Tallinn University and EPANUS for organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. It's been a pleasure to be on this panel. Thanks to all the organizers and the audience for their very insightful questions.
Likewise. And thanks, Una.